Good morning. Thank you, Frank, and the Ontario Natural Building Coalition for inviting me. I don't remember what we were talking about on Facebook, but he said, hey, if you happen to be in the United States in March, we're having this conference. And actually, that was just the time I wanted to come back and visit my parents. So the timing was perfect. Getting here wasn't as easy as I had hoped. But yeah, and you know, there's been challenges along the way. We sent a pallet of tools and materials from Japan in January, and it was supposed to arrive on March 3rd. Now the expected date is April 14th. So yeah, I wanted to have a lot more things with me here, but we'll make do with what we have. I'm a researcher at Nihon University, and I also work as a straw bale builder and plaster in Japan, and have a small company that sells Japanese tools. Okay, I'll begin. So today I want to talk about past and present natural building in Japan. And from the past, we're going to take a look at timber framing, stone foundations, thatched roofing, and then mainly earth and lime plastering. So I'll just touch on the other topics and mainly talk about plastering. And then I'm going to take a look at just some examples of contemporary natural building in Japan, taking a look at straw bale, light straw clay, and tatami insulation. One characteristic of natural building in Japan, and I think this is probably true of vernacular architecture everywhere in the world, is that all of the materials were sourced locally. And in Japan, you see wood, bamboo, stone, clay, thatch, all sourced from, you know, the local environment, and then that was processed locally and then used to build homes. And the architecture we're going to look at is mainly homes as opposed to temples or other things. Yeah. There's a famous carpenter in Japan named Tsunekazu Nishioka. He passed away recently, but he was the carpenter of Horyuji Temple in Nara. And he had this quote, "Don't buy building materials, buy a mountain." And he was very adamant about using timber in the way that it grew. So trees on the south side of the mountain were used on the south side of the building, using the aspect of the tree. So if it was growing, you know, with this aspect facing south, it was used in that aspect. You know, you wouldn't turn a tree upside down for a post. The roots were down in the, and this is kind of reflective of this old tradition in Japan where the carpenter would draw the plans for the house, and then the soma, who was like the forester, would go out into the mountains and find the tree that best fit that need. And then the soma would bring the trees back to the carpenter, and then the carpenter would do the joinery. And it could be the same in North America, I'm not sure, but generally the choice of timber for different purposes. For posts, it's Japanese cypress because of its compressive strength. For beams, pine because of its bending strength. And for the roof structure, Japanese cedar because it's lightweight. And even today, the timber framers that are doing the traditional timber framing draw the plans for the house on a piece of wood, generally plywood now. And they'll work from a floor plan and a section and maybe an elevation, and that's it. The rest is in their head.
How do they get a permit?
The traditional timber framers, if they're building in an area that requires a building permit, then they hire an architect to do drawings and do it that way. Yeah, but they'll work from that. And yeah, and then generally, to go into a little more detail, because there's probably a lot of people who are interested in timber framing here, much more than what I'm familiar with. But then they'll have a long, thin stick where they'll mark all the joints on that. They don't use a tape measure for lining out the joints because, you know, there could be discrepancies in that. So they use a very long stick, and that's the guide for lining out all the joints in terms of the height of the joints. And I think probably in Japan, for a carpenter, what's the most important skill for a carpenter in Japan, for a timber framer? Sharpening? Is that what I heard? Yeah. Yeah, that's right. That's right. If you don't have sharp tools, you can't do clean work. So a couple of years ago, I was working for a timber framing company, and I was doing mainly plastering, but we didn't have plaster work all the time. So then I was helping the carpenters in the off time, and it was, you know, like every morning, every day after work, sharpening, you know, learning to keep that angle with your hand so you could keep the angle of the blade. Next. And this is a video. This is a home that we built, that company that I was working for. The structure goes up in about 2 weeks. The roof is on in 2 weeks, and it's probably 3 to 6 months before that of all the joinery. And then once the roof is on, we put up the bamboo lattice for the walls, and then earth plaster. And it's probably all done in about a month or two, and then the base coat of plaster has to dry. And depending on the season, it can take at least a month for it to dry. If it was summer, it would be about a month. If it was winter, it's going to take much longer for it to dry. You can kind of see some of our breaks. We're caught by the time lapse. And up until these rafters, there were no metal fasteners used in the frame. It's all joinery. And then the first time nails are used are for the rafters to nail those down. And you can't really see from this angle, but over the span of that rafter, it's bent, I think, probably about an inch every 6 feet.
The whole thing?
The whole thing, yeah, the rafter.
Like crown?
Yeah, you can kind of see there.
Yeah.
And you'll notice that most of the roof lines in traditional Japanese architecture aren't straight. They're either bent in that direction, or you see in the temples the opposite direction. And once you get used to seeing that, when you see a straight roof line, it's yeah. So the rafter is generally, like in North America, we would use something that's narrow and deep, because that's the way that the wood is strongest. And in Japan, we'd have to use something much more square in order to bend it over that span.
So you're not cutting. You're cambering it. You're not cutting. So you haven't cut any of that grain.
No.
No.
Yeah.
Are they bent over the point not over the purlins?
That's right. Yeah.
So there's stressed intention on top.
Yeah. And the tradition apparently with that is, and it comes from kind of the tea culture, the roof over time is going to bend at the eaves. Because of the weight of the roof. So they were like, why don't we just do that at the beginning? And and it kind of has that wabi-sabi look, kind of the rustic, time-tested look. Okay. I'll talk just a little bit about stone foundations. There's two general types of stone foundations: pure foundations and then a perimeter foundation. And on the left, you see an example of a big pure foundation, and then the small tea house at the bottom is a pure foundation. And there's no fastening between the post and the pier. The post is just set on the stone, and the reason for that is in the event of an earthquake, if it can move, it's much more durable than having a fixed foundation in an earthquake. Of course, that goes against all of our current thinking on earthquakes. Yeah.
So really, it's just to lift the post out of the...
to keep it away from the ground. Yep. Yep.
Is there not even a centering pit or anything on that?
There is now in the homes that I've worked on, but traditionally you shape the post to the stone. You cut it with a compass so it fits the stone, and that way also the water can drain away from it. And you'll also notice that same compass work was used for this base plate, the sill. Yeah, it's cut perfectly to fit the stone. Yeah. And Japan has a very long tradition of stonework, of dry masonry. There's no mortar used in these stone walls. And I know the lineage of craftsmen, Anoshu, stone masonry. Now the current master is, I think, 16th generation. And he traces his lineage all the way back to the Korean Peninsula when the artisans first came over from Korea. Using as uncut stone as possible. I mean, he'll shape it some with a stone chisel, but generally it's used as uncut as possible, and it survives earthquakes. So he says that his father, or his master, is actually his grandfather was the person he learned from, could listen to the stones. Like the stones would tell him where they wanted to be placed. He hasn't gotten there yet. Talk a little bit about roofing materials. There's three traditional types of roofing materials in Japan. Thatched roofs, which consist of straw or reed, Japanese cypress bark roofs, and tile in cities. And of these, you kind of have like an order of magnitude of expense. At this time in Japan, tile roofs being the least expensive, then a thatched roof, which is outside of the financial means of most people, and then the cypress bark roofs that are only used for temples and shrines. One shingle will be probably about $22 of this. Yeah, and for the Japanese cypress bark, they take the bark off the tree while it's still living, and it has to be taken off very thin, or they'll kill the tree. And the first time you take it off, apparently you can't use it. It's thrown away, and it takes 20 years to regenerate. And from that second generation, you take the bark and you use it, and you keep taking the bark off the same trees every 20 years. That kind of explains the cost of the roofing material.
It's almost as expensive as a biro
shades. You probably know the reason why tile is most common in cities is because it's fire resistant. And traditionally in Japan, probably over 90% of the homes were thatched. And most of the farmers used straw, and those communities that could develop a system used reed. And I'm going to talk in more detail just about the thatched roofing now. So we'll take a look at the origins, a little bit at the structure, and then the process and the integration, both biological and social, of thatched roofs. The first buildings in Japan probably had no walls, as we think of walls. They were just a continuous roof, like this. And this is an example of a building from the earliest periods in Japan. And there's still pottery that exists, that remains from this period in Japan. And this is kind of an example of what their homes looked like. And then what happened is those first buildings were built with mainly hardwoods, kind of like a teepee or a round structure. And then as we developed softwoods and the ability to do joinery, they lifted that roof off the ground, built walls, and then you still see the structure of the roof is still kind of the same as it was hundreds of years ago. The structure of the roof consists of round cedar, rafters, and then bamboo purlins on that, and that's the bamboo is what the thatch is tied to. And you'll notice that there's no fasteners used for attaching the cedar rafters and the bamboo purlins. It's all lashed with mainly straw rope, or in, if we go to the next slide, no problem, or in some places in Japan it's also lashed with vines,
Grapevines.
or
Totally.
or even small trees. So this is a coppice. You know, when you coppice the tree, when it gets to just the right diameter, you can cut that and then pound it and bend it and twist it and use that as lashing. And I've seen these flowering before on a new roof.
Wow.
Yeah. And over the eaves, where you need more reinforcement to keep the thatch from bending, generally a very strong, stiff plant was used. And in Japan, that was one of the plants that was used was hemp. It had a strong stalk to keep it from bending at the eaves. And then, yeah, go ahead.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Sure.
Are they building this inside of the greenhouse?
Yeah, it was an example, kind of. The company was doing an example there, like a training. And then, just like any kind of roofing material, working from the eaves, and you saw before that the bamboo purlins run kind of parallel to the ridge, and then parallel with those, you'll have additional bamboo on the outside of the thatch, and that outside and inside bamboo is tied together with straw rope, and that pinches the thatch to hold it in place. Kind of one characteristic of thatching, and it's very different from carpentry and plastering, is that almost all the tools can be made very simply by the craftsman. And oftentimes, like, kind of the ideal in traditional Japan was the community would come together to thatch a roof, and you would only have to bring your lunch, because you could get there and you could make the tools that you needed right on site. So this is a good friend of mine, Nakano-san, and he's making the needle just out of a piece of bamboo. And these are like the wood tools that you would use. I mean, I'm sure they don't make these new every time, but they're not difficult to make.
Are thatchers getting more rare? Like, are there many people still doing thatch roofs?
Yeah, I mean, financially, it's very difficult for a homeowner to have their home rethatched. It was, yeah, I guess this is a good time to mention this. Traditionally in Japan, homes were thatched as a community. Each family would have a thatch pad that they would maintain, and their own thatch field wouldn't produce enough thatch to re-thatch their home or even a portion of their home. So the entire community would gather all the thatch they harvested that year and re-thatch someone's home or a portion of one person's home. And that reduced the need to store thatch, and that was the traditional method. It was called a yui system. Yui means to, like, tie together. It was the yui system. And in recent years, that's fallen apart. So now the only people doing thatch roofing in Japan are the companies. I did go and help out. You know, like a retired man rethatched his house with his buddies. It was a 300-year-old home. It was the third time in his life that this home had been rethatched, and he and his buddies collected all the thatch, and they did it all themselves, but that's very, very rare. Now it's probably 99% done by companies, and these companies, probably the majority of their money comes from the government, either, you know, like federal or the prefectural or like the municipality, and then the homeowner is generally subsidized at least a portion to rethatch, and that's done in like if in a historical district only. So the thatched homes, I think when I was talking to Nakano-san, he said that there's probably 1,000 thatched homes in Japan, and
100 years ago, there would have been.
Yeah, more and more and more.
So the great cost is labor, really, purely labor.
Yep, yep, entirely labor, harvesting the thatch and then also putting it up. There was a question in the back. Yeah.
Would thatch still be grown domestically, like,
Yeah.
or they're not shipping thatch?
No, they're not importing thatch as far as I know. Yep.
Do you know what species they use?
I can figure out for you really quick. I know that the common name is Japanese silvergrass. But, okay. And then kind of as opposed to Korean or Southeast Asia where the thatch is put on with the ear facing down. In Japan, it's almost generally the stalk facing down, and then it's trimmed. And that's kind of reflective of the Japanese aesthetic, of taking kind of these rough materials like we saw with the stone or the timber and making it very refined. And one of the neat things about thatching is that there's no waste. Traditionally in Japan, when you would re-thatch, you would take all the old thatch off the roof and you would compost it. No problem. And then that compost was used for growing rice and for growing vegetables. So there was this, this cascade of the thatch. Actually, even before the thatch got on the roof, in northern Japan where it's very cold, it was used as insulation. Like they would cut the thatch right in the fall, stack it up against their house's insulation, and then the next year they would put it on their roof. And then 20 years later they would take it off the roof and compost it and it would go in their garden. Yeah. And I'm sorry, I mentioned that earlier. Every family would keep a thatch field. Yeah, these are some photos of the harvest. Now this is actually Kobe or Osaka along a main river. Harvesting thatch there. And every couple of years they'll do a field burn. It's not done every year, but the advantage of doing the field burn is that it kills any of the trees or other species that might take over the thatch, because thatch is very resistant to fire.
Does it need fire to open any seed pods, or does it?
No. No. And over the course of thousands of years, there's become like this special symbiosis, like of special species habitat with the thatch. But now in modern times, if the thatch fields aren't harvested and if they're not burned, they're overgrown. And this is a thatch field that's been overgrown with kazoo. Yeah, I think that the same species is in North America as well.
Not so much here.
So in recent years in Japan, there's kind of become a thatch revival. And a lot of people, this is, students are idealistic. And they want to maintain the landscape. So people go out and they cut the thatch and then they give it to the thatchers to use. And even, because thatching traditionally wasn't a trade per se. Farmers, people did their own thatch roofs. It's a great place to have workshops, and a lot of people. It has the kind of the social integration aspect as well. Okay, the topic I'm going to probably talk at the most depth about is Japanese plastering, traditional Japanese plastering. And we're going to take a look at the history, kind of the fundamentals, the plastering sequence and procedures, some finishes, and then looking at Japanese trowels, the manufacturing process, the different steels, temperaments, and types of trowels. Japanese plastering has its roots in three things: tea, fire, and war. And I'll explain each of those in more detail, but let's go on to tea houses. So tea seeds were first brought to Japan, I think, in the 9th century, and in the 12th century, the tea ceremony, or drinking tea, kind of began to flourish in Japan, mainly in temples, because the monks would drink tea as a stimulant to stay awake during meditation. And then in the 16th century, Senorikyu, who was a Zen practitioner, kind of formalized the tea ceremony. And in Japan there are a number of tea schools now, and he's kind of the founder of, or held as the founder of all of those tea schools. hold on a second. He was killed. He was ordered to commit ritual suicide by Hideyoshi. He was the leader of Japan at the time, because Senorikyu was kind of a revolutionary. And in terms of plastering, he was the first person to plaster a tea house in earth. And at the time in Japan, earth was for commoners. And the aristocracy finished their buildings with lime. I mean, of course, the core of the walls was earth and bamboo. It was the same structure, but the finish, the commoners weren't allowed to use the color white. That was saved for the aristocracy. And so they would finish their buildings in lime or with paper. Japanese paper was another common finish over the earth. And Senorikyu was the first person to finish a tea house in earth and then, invite all of the important people to come and have tea there. So it was really revolutionary for tea. Hold on a second. Okay. And from there, the tea ceremony spread throughout Japan. And the aesthetic spread as well. And the people building tea houses were the people with power and with money. And so when they would build a tea house, they would give the craftsmen as much time and money as they needed to build the best, the next best thing. And that's one of the reasons why earth plastering in Japan excelled to such a high level, was because of, they had the time and money to do good work, and then they had kind of this aesthetic to work with. The next reason why I think plastering in Japan developed to a high level was because of fire. And we see that in the earthen store. The first purpose of the earthen storehouses was to protect valuables and food from fire. And to kind of explain the structure a little bit about this, you have a timber frame with a round bamboo lattice tied to the outside of the timber frame, and then about a foot of earth plaster packed, of like cob packed to that bamboo lattice, and then finished with lime generally. And this is sometimes they use black tiles in this case with like a lime grout. A note on this: the grout comes out from the wall, and the farther the grout comes out from the wall, the more time it takes to do, and so it's like a status. The owner is showing kind of how much money I have. This is how far the grout comes out from my tiles. And basically all of the decorative work on there it's all like a status symbol from the owner showing their wealth. You would never do your house like that, because kind of like the Japanese aesthetic is you want your home simple, because that's where you go to sleep. You wouldn't want a really vibrant. You wouldn't want to sleep in a really vibrant room, right? You want to sleep in a simple room because that calms you. So the place where they would show their wealth of the decoration is in the storehouses. Hold on a second. Yeah, and then this is the interior of the wall. Generally, the interior is an exposed timber frame, so you can see the posts. And a note about that building on the left. That building is in northern Japan, very, very northern Japan. I don't remember the name of the craftsman who built it, but during his life, he built 4 of those buildings. He plastered 4 during his life. And I think that building took about 10 years to build. So a completely different time span from what we have in the industrial era. And then the third reason why Japanese plastering developed to such a high extent is because of war. And you see that in castles. And the characteristic of castles, there's these very big walls that need to be finished without joints. And if you've ever seen a section of a Japanese wall, we'll see a photo in just a bit. The veneer, the lime veneer, is very, very thin. It's just a couple of millimeters over an earthen wall. So in order to be able to finish that big wall with a very thin lime veneer, you had to use a glue that would prevent the lime from hardening up. It would keep it moist longer. It would keep it from drying out. And that's where the use of seaweed glues came in. They started using a seaweed glue to be able to finish a very big wall without a joint. I spoke a little bit about the structure of the buildings, but we'll talk a little bit about kind of the fundamentals. In Japan, we think of, in terms of plastering, we think of two different types of walls. On the left is the exposed timber, and on the right, the concealed timber. Okay. And in both cases, we use a bamboo lattice. And in the exposed timber, you use this tool that you see on the left to split the bamboo. And then that split bamboo is woven between the posts, which provides like a plaster stop on both sides of the bamboo. So the timber is exposed on both sides. And then the concealed timber, you use a round bamboo lattice on the exterior of the timber frame. This is kind of what an exposed timber interior might look like. And then this is the concealed timber. Round bamboo, and then a lot of earth, about a foot thick of earth plaster on that. And then generally a lime finish. Yeah?
Once you split the bamboo like that, when you're applying the plaster, it doesn't have like does it have a lot of give to it?
It does.
Yeah.
It does have give to it. About every foot in the wall is what we call itsuridake, and that's bamboo that's a little bit longer, and at that point in the post, there's a small hole that the bamboo is stuck into, and that's the only thing that holds the wall in place. About every foot those are in, both horizontally and vertically. And I'm not sure if I have any in this PowerPoint, but examples of the more detail of the bamboo. Go ahead. Yeah, sorry, I don't have any in this one. Maybe another time. Next, I'll talk about kind of the plastering sequence. So the first step in plastering is kind of preparing the mud, and generally the base coat in Japan is made with a fermented mud and straw mix. Why do they ferment the earth and straw in Japan? Yeah. Yeah, there is a chemical process going on. As the straw breaks down, as the cellulose breaks down in the straw, it produces a polysaccharide, which functions like a glue, which makes it greater adhesive strength, and also it helps it dry slower because it's that the glues help to keep things moist longer, which makes it stronger, and also you don't need as much water to make the plaster workable. It's a plasticizer, right? These polysaccharides act like a plasticizer, so you don't need as much water to make the plaster workable. And if you don't use as much water, you have less evaporation when it's drying. And if you have less evaporation, you have less cracking, and you have a stronger plaster. Yeah, go ahead. How do they initiate it? Just time. When?
No, make it wet. How does that get going? Is it just the amount of organic material that's in the
Yeah.
whatever bacteria is present?
Yeah, we take about equal volumes of straw and earth, and cut the straw up, and mix it with the earth, and let it ferment for at least 3 months, ideally at least half a year up to a year.
You have to keep it moist, don't you?
Yeah, it has to be moist. Yeah.
And it doesn't break the straw down to the point of composting.
If you let it sit over a year, it will break down even farther. As the straw kind of consists of cellulose and lignin, and as it breaks down, as I understand it, the lignin, which is more resistant, remains kind of like these when you look at it in the fiber mix, it almost looks like the hairs on your head. The straws break down into all these fine hairs. And the more of those fine hairs you can get into the plaster, the stronger it is. So oftentimes, even after a year, you know, like the people who have real peculiarities will even put more straw in and ferment it more to get, you know, more of this fine-like hair fiber in their mix. Yeah, it smells. Yeah, it smells.
In the bullet building process, you have to have this reserve of
Exactly.
on the building site.
In Japan, fortunately, we still have companies that make this and deliver it to the building site. And though they're, I mean, they used to be in every part of Japan, and now there's maybe 25 in Japan. And fortunately, I'm really lucky to have one very close to where I live. Not from far away. No. And it's actually very, very inexpensive. It's probably about the same price as concrete, you know, which is probably like $100 a cubic meter in Japan, or maybe more, to $150. $150.
What's the typical length they cut the straw to?
Oh yeah, this is what I wanted to mention. So, you know why I think fermenting earthen straw arose? It wasn't because they thought, yeah, we're going to make this thing really strong. It's because cutting up the straw was like so tedious. You know, so what they would do is they would just take like long straw and mix it with mud. You know, just stomp it and mix it and leave it for half a year, and then you had like this plaster, because the earth would break down the straw. And now today we cut the straw up into about 15 centimeter or 20 centimeter, 15 centimeter lengths, and then ferment it. Yeah, you can imagine in like pre-industrial Japan, without, you know, mechanical tools to cut straw, that was a lot of labor. Yeah.
What kind of straw are you using mostly in your plaster? Is it rice?
Rice straw. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. So these are two videos. Try the one on the left first. Yep. No problem. There we are. And this is kind of an example of the initial application. And this guy on the right, he's the Saitori, right? That's the youngest guy on the work site. He's the Saitori, so he feeds everyone else.
You should have that.
Yeah. And if you'd like a sai, I can get you a sai from Japan. And then can you press the video on the right? And so this is kind of what it looks like from the other direction. You see that like the mud with lots of straw fibers in it goes through the bamboo lattice, and then either that same day, so like if you did one side in the morning, you might do the other side in the afternoon, or I like to wait till the next day. You do the next side, so there's they become one around the bamboo. Okay. And okay. And then the base coat, right? So you do both sides, and then before you move on to the brown coat or the Chirimawari, still part of like the base coat is you do both sides again, and we call it in Japanese the onaoshi, which means like the big fix. So as you do your base coat, it's quite rough and it might sag a little bit, and so the onaoshi, you generally get a plane. You'll create a plane, and you add some sand to your arakabe, to your base coat, and you make a plane. And that's basically what we have here. We have the base coat done, and now then we move on to the Chirimawari. And the Chirimawari, it determines the final finish level of the plaster. And you go around all of the windows, all of the doors, you go around all of the woodwork and plaster at a bevel to determine your finish level. So in order to mark out your finish level, you'll drop a chalk line. Actually, we use an ink line, but you'll lay out your finish level on all your doors and windows and woodwork. And then to prevent a gap from opening between the plaster and the wood, oftentimes we'll use two different products, a noren or higiko. And these are almost never used today in Japan, very, very rarely. I mean, earth plastering in Japan is still like a very small percentage. And then even in the earth plastering, higiko and noren is still quite small. But traditionally, this is what was used. Hemp mosquito netting was attached to a very small piece of stick, and that stick was nailed into the woodwork, and then the hemp netting was embedded into the plaster like we see here. And that prevented a gap from opening up between the woodwork and the plaster. Yeah. Another method is higiko, and this is a very small nail with long hemp fibers tied to it, and the small nails are pounded into the woodwork, just behind that line, just behind your finish, and those hemp fibers are buried into the plaster, which prevents the plaster from pulling apart from the timber. And then the brown coat is applied, the fill coat, and you do as many passes as you need to be able to reach that finish level, and you'll do a brown coat up to your finish level. And sometimes, that's a video, go ahead and start that. Sometimes the brown coat in Japan is oftentimes used as a finish coat. It's like a finished brown coat. And then other times in Japan you'll go over the brown coat with a finish. And this here is a video of kind of the typical brown coat application. This is Kusumi Akira-san, and he's kind of the godfather of the natural plaster movement in Japan today. One characteristic of our walls in Japan, especially interiors, is that traditionally there was an exposed timber frame. So you had all of these small walls you had to plaster, about 90 centimeters in width. So our plastering sequence, kind of the foundation of our work, is built on plastering these segments. Hold on a second. Kind of we talked about with timber framing, the foundational skill for a timber framer was sharpening, and the foundational skill for a plastering is the brown coat application. If you can't do the brown coat application, you can't do a finish coat, because the finish coats tend to be very, very thin, and they'll show any mistakes in your brown coat. So this is kind of the foundation for plasterers. Our process of plastering, kind of like this panel, is the same way that you write the Chinese character for mouth. You go down on the left side, then across the top, down on the bottom, and then across the bottom, and then fill in the middle. And there are some regional variations, like Kusumi-san is from Osaka, or he's actually not from Osaka, but he's from the Osaka area, and his way of plastering is kind of reflective of that. The plasters in Kyoto have their own style for doing the brown coat. The general process is the same, but the movement of the trowel is a little different.
So the earth is still an earth, a right straw mixture?
Yes, yeah, for the brown coat. And the plasters in Japan and every part of Japan are slightly different too. And one of the reasons why plastering in Kyoto developed to such a high level is because there's an earth in Kyoto called Juraku, and Juraku is very water resistant. And that's one of the reasons why you see so much earth on exteriors in Kyoto, is because they have this great clay to work with locally. and also the earth that they use for the brown coat from Kusaksa is like this earth that's perfectly balanced for the brown coat. All you have to do is add straw fibers, and you're ready to go. You don't need to add any sand. One of the advantages of not having to add sand to your earth is that it's much more water resistant, and it doesn't suck as much water from your finish coat. So when you're doing your finish has much better workability, the plaster, because it's not having all of the moisture sucked by the brown coat. If you have a lot of sand in your brown coat, it's going to suck the moisture from your finish. But some parts in Japan, like Shiga Prefecture, the clay, the earth is like a really strong clay. So you have to add tons of sand to make it workable.
And finish with paper.
Yeah. Yeah. And so this afternoon we have 3 panels set up in there's a two-story building over there with a red Mazda car out front. We drove that from Japan here. No. On the second floor of that, we've got 3 panels set up, and we're going to do basically the same practice. And what you do is you put it on, and then like he's doing here, you take it off. And put it on and take it off, and put it on and take it off, and that's kind of the life of an apprentice in Japan. Yeah. Yeah.
Sisyphus.
Benshu is like the common Japanese for practice, but like they call it like hanpuku in Kyoto, and I'm not sure why or what that means, but yeah. We're going to take a quick look at some of the exteriors that are or the exterior finishes that are commonly used in Japan. Okay, next slide. So the kind of like the classical finish is Shikkui, and it's the white finish that you probably might be familiar with from seeing photos of Japanese architecture. Shikkui consists of 3 ingredients: hydrated lime, hemp fibers, and seaweed glue. This is a photo from a workshop that we held in Germany last fall. We held 2 workshops in Germany last fall. The first one was with the German national team, because they have like a team of plasters, young plasters. I think they have to be under 23, and they compete in like international competitions, like skills competitions. And we had one workshop with them, great skill level, and another workshop with a big building company in Berlin. And this is a photo from the company in Berlin. We were using some mixed lime plasters that we sent over from Japan. That arrived in time, yeah. So the first ingredient of Japanese shikkui is lime, hydrated lime, and that's made from limestone. And limestone is probably one of the most abundant natural resources in Japan. And the Japanese use of limestone is very sparingly and very energy efficient. I'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute. And another characteristic of limestone in Japan is there are many quarries of generally pure limestone, which produces a pure white plaster. And the advantage of that is that white plasters tend to hide inconsistencies better than a colored plaster will. Another special characteristic of lime plasters in Japan is that the lime is fired with salt. And the advantage of adding salt to the plaster, the reason why the salt is added to the plaster is because the finished product requires less water to become workable. And just like how the glue, the advantage of adding glue to the plaster, you have the same advantage of adding some salt when the lime is fired. It requires less water to become workable, which means less evaporation and a stronger plaster.
And that is a sodium salt?
Yeah, I think it's probably sea salt. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you get efflorescence from having salt in the mix?
No efflorescence from having salt in it, but we definitely have efflorescence if you plaster in cold weather.
Is that one that like the white
film show.
Yeah.
show through.
Yeah. Yeah, lime work in Japan should be done in summer or when it's above 10 degrees Celsius. Yeah. The next ingredient is seaweed glue. There's two types of seaweed that are used in Japan. They're both red algae and they're both non-edible. They're boiled in water, and then that boiled water is poured through a sieve to remove any of the solids, and that water, that starch glue, is, in the case of these plasters, is dried, and then that powder is mixed with the lime. Or you can just use the liquid directly, and that's how it was traditionally used. And then the last ingredient was traditionally hemp fibers, and today we use recycled jute fibers, like coffee sacks. Those are cut up and pounded into small fibers, and the fibers are bleached, and that's what we use in the plaster. The advantage of using the hemp fibers is that it creates a plaster that's very with very high bending strength and tensile strength. Because we all know that buildings in Japan are made to move, right? They're going to move at some time in their life, so you need a plaster that's flexible. That's probably one of the characteristics of plasters in Japan, is that I think there's a lot of fiber used in the plasters. Generally in Europe, we have a load-bearing building tradition where buildings aren't expected to move. So you can use a lot of sand in your plaster because it doesn't have to move. It has to have compressive strength. Whereas in Japan, the walls are non-load bearing. The weight of the structure is carried by posts, and they have to be flexible to move.
Why bleach? Is that to stabilize it?
Oh, why make it white?
Yeah.
That's so it doesn't show up.
It's just aesthetic.
Yeah, aesthetic. Something else I wanted to mention when we were talking about the Japanese timber frame, or when we were looking at the structure of the walls, was that there's no diagonal bracing in the traditional Japanese timber frame. And anybody who's involved in architecture knows that the triangle is kind of the foundation of making stable buildings. And there's no triangle in traditional Japanese timber framing. And the reason for that is because if you had a triangle and an earthquake that was stronger than one segment of the triangle, the building would collapse. But by having a timber frame with no triangle but just horizontal braces, it can move. It can move. Okay. And these three ingredients, the lime, the seaweed glue, and the jute fibers, are used to make the Japanese lime plaster. Another finish that I like with lime plaster is called the Hikizuri finish, and you can do the same finish with earth as well by adding glue to the earth. But because the plaster is so sticky, if you use a special trowel, a Hikizuri trowel, and we've got two over there for sale. The trowel you can see here is rounded on the bottom, and what that does is it pulls the plaster as it goes across the wall, which creates like a textured effect. Another common finish in Japan is tosa shikkui. And tosa shikkui only has two ingredients, hydrated lime and straw fibers. And they're fermented for 3 months to 3 years. You mix hydrated lime, slaked lime mixed with water, and straw fibers and let it ferment. And then that's delivered to the work site as a wet plaster, and then it still needs to be reworked from there. But it's even stronger than the traditional shikkui because there's no glue added to the plaster. Like we talked about before, when the cellulose breaks down, it creates a polysaccharide, which creates a glue. And that gives it, the straw fibers give it a slight yellow color. But if you use it on the exterior, it will over time be bleached by the sun and turn back to white. Oh, this is a video. I can find out. I don't know off the top of my head. Yeah, and Tosa Shikkui, the name is from Kochi-ken, which is a place in Japan which is really prone to typhoons. And this is the finish that was developed in Kochi-ken for their buildings. They apply it about 1 centimeter thick, and they compress it down to about 6 millimeters. So it's applied very thick, much thicker than regular Shikkui, and then compressed, and it's very strong to typhoons. You see a similar plaster in Okinawa, which is also prone to typhoons. And there they mix quicklime with straw, and then let that ferment. Okay. This is a video. I worked for 2 summers with 2 Japanese plasterers south of Calgary, and even the masters make mistakes. Right. He was saying, "Are you filming? Are you filming?" Yeah. This is an oats mix, and oats is another very common exterior-interior finish in Japan, consisting of about 1 part lime with 3 parts earth, and then hemp fibers or jute fibers. And it's generally a compressed finish. Handa is another common finish, mixing Tosa Shikkui and earth for an exterior. And Mizugone is probably kind of the pinnacle of Japanese earth plastering. Requires incredible skill to use, and this is the ideal finish for Japanese tea rooms or Japanese style rooms. It's the most expensive finish because of its difficulty. But it's a very thin, very fine finished plaster over a wet brown coat. So you'll apply the brown coat very quickly, and while it's still moist, you apply the Mizugone over that. Mizugone, like there are kind of, if you have a brown coat with relatively coarse earth and aggregate and straw fibers, Mizugone is the other end of the spectrum. With you have your finest clays and your finest straw fibers in Mizugone. It's also kind of reflective of the Japanese aesthetic of being like delicate and frail. I mean, like if you rub this, it would crumble. I mean, it's not that weak, but it doesn't have a lot of abrasion. It doesn't have a lot of resistance to abrasion. Okay. Another example of Mizugone that's common is kyosabi, and what you do is you add iron filaments or flakes of iron to an earth plaster, and over time those earth flakes will rust, and that's what gives it kind of its spotted effect. And then taking that another step further is hotarukabe. And what will happen is the earths that have some sulfur in it will develop these white spots. And the sulfur is like, less than 1%, and I mean it's less than that. But if you don't have that in the plaster, the iron flakes will just rust. But if there's some sulfur in the earth, you don't add it. It's just naturally in the earth. Some earths will do this. You get these white, and hotaru means firefly. So you get like these white fireflies around the flakes. And you'll notice that the whole wall has become darker. In Japan, we call that rusting. I don't know if earths in Canada also do that too. But a lot of the earths in Japan will turn dark over time. And basically what's happening chemically is we used to think that it was the iron that was making the earth turn dark, but it's actually the magnesium. I have a friend in Japan who researches these things. He's a 4th generation plasterer in Kyoto who has a PhD. Yeah. And I can't remember what the instrument they used to do this, but somehow they could figure out the chemical composition at just the surface of the earth. And they found that the areas where it was turning white, they found out the areas where it was turning dark was magnesium in the soil. The magnesium was what was rusting and turning dark. Okay. Another common finish on exteriors is a scratch finish. And oftentimes, because earth is weak to water, if you still want a natural appearance, you can add some cement to it. And then we'll do a scratched finish, and we use like a little block like this with nails. It's easy to make. We also provide it through Kiwado, our company. Or, if you look at the next slide, a wire brush, and this is a video, if you click on that. And this is actually the last job I did just before coming to the United States. In Kyoto, we did a sand lime. It's just sand, 3 parts sand, 1 part lime by weight. And then the next day, when it's stiff enough, scratch the surface, which exposes all of the sand in the plaster. And if you have an attractive sand, it's a good-looking finish. And after it's done, just take a brush and dust it off, and it won't dust after that. It's still weak like lime is, for the first couple of months. It hasn't come to full strength. But this is on the left is an earthen scratched finish. So
I've seen this kind of thing as an erosion block to separate. Martin Rauch's doing it in Austria all the time. And do you have any comment on the spacing or?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Oftentimes, if you look at Japanese earthen walls, I'm sorry I don't have any photos here, but I've got lots of great photos. They'll include tile in the wall that sticks out just a bit from the wall, and that acts like a drip edge. Yeah. So when the water runs down the wall, it hits that tile, it comes out just a bit from the wall and then falls.
So it breaks the momentum. So there's a long stretch where water can
exactly.
gain momentum. Exactly.
And then also in the earthen walls, they would embed tile in the wall as they were stacking up the cob to make the wall. And the advantages of that is that, well, it reduces any vertical cracking. Also, the tiles will absorb water, so it allows you to build faster than if you were just using cob. And it's also a great way to get rid of broken tiles. But this on the left is it's an interior finish if it's just earth, and this is just design. It's Kusumi Akira-san, the plaster that we saw before doing the brown coat. It's his son. This is his work. Yeah. And then another common finish is an exposed aggregate finish, and this is generally just cement and an attractive aggregate. Used in areas where you need more water resistance. And those were the common exterior finishes, kind of the natural plastering exterior finishes. And now the common interior finishes include all of the exteriors. You can do them on the interior as well. Polished finishes, and then earthen plasters containing glues. Okay, go to the next one. So kind of, I think one of what every plasterer in Japan would love to do is a polished oats. Every plasterer, this is kind of like another one of the pinnacles of natural plastering in Japan. And oats consists of earth, lime, one part lime, 3 parts earth, and paper fibers, Japanese paper fibers. And the paper fibers are pounded with bamboo to break apart the fibers into even smaller pieces, and then those are mixed with the earth. And I remember asking my teacher once, why can't we just use a blender to cut up these fibers? And he's like, no, you need to you need to use bamboo. I've never tried a blender. Maybe it works. But so if you have a finished brown coat, and then over the brown coat we do what we call haitsuchi, which means lime and earth. It's a lime-earth mix with straw fibers. And you do a layer of that, and then the polished oats is just a very thin veneer over the haitsuchi. And first you compress the haitsuchi to a pretty high compression, and when it's dried out enough just to be able to suck moisture again, then you go over it with the finished veneer. This is a video. Another very attractive finished plaster is polished Tosa Shikkui. And Tosa Shikkui is the rice lime plaster, right? So what you do is you take that rice lime plaster and it's put through a sieve. And in this case, it was through a pretty big sieve. This is like at least 1 millimeter or 1.5 millimeter sieve. But if you want to make it much easier to plaster, put it through like 100 mesh or 150 mesh. So you get a very fine cream, which makes it easier to plaster. And then that cream is mixed with a pigment, in this case a black pigment, which is probably 50-50 of pigment and that. So there's no unevenness in color. He's a very strong pigment, and then polished. This particular pigment is made from soot, from pine soot.
How durable is that? Like, wash it once it's dry and everything? Is that polished finish?
Well, it still needs time to cure.
Once it's done.
And yeah, once it's cured, I think it's very durable. Yeah, I mean, because of its cost, it wouldn't be a common finish in your house. It would just be like a detail maybe in your bathroom, in an entranceway, in a stairwell. Generally, in Japan, the polished or the compressed finishes are used in places where you're liable to touch the wall by accident. So in an entryway or in a stairwell or in your bathroom around a sink.
Would it compare to a Cadillac?
No, I don't think it's as durable as a Cadillac because Cadillac is so thick, right? And this is just a very thin veneer.
So you're not making a shower surround?
No, none of these are used in like places where there's continuous water. Because we don't in Japan traditionally have a tradition of that. In those places we would use wood, or like you saw the exposed aggregate finish, or yeah, the exposed aggregate finish would be a common one in those areas, or tile. Tile is very common.
So it's just used instead of the finer ones that would rub off, you use polished finish.
Yeah.
You have the ones.
Yep, use a polished finish. And in Japanese style rooms or in tea houses, you live in the center of the room. You don't touch the wall or lean against the wall, which doesn't really go along with our contemporary lifestyles. So there's, even in Japan now, we're changing what we do in order to meet the needs of, contemporary living. Okay. And this next finish that's commonly used in interiors is an earthen plasters with glue in them, and these aren't used in exteriors. Apparently because the glues will rehydrate. I don't know exactly. I do know that earthen plasters with glue tend to be more brittle over time. So they say that like the mizugone, although it's more fragile at first, it has less abrasion resistance. It can be used on exteriors because it is more resistant to water and has a more durability over time than a plaster with glue. And this is kind of an example of how sticky these earthen glue plasters are when you add the seaweed glue to it. And generally they don't have, if they have any straw fibers in it, it's very little. And this is also a very thin veneer over a brown coat. The advantage of Noritsuchi is that you can let your brown coat dry completely. And because it has so much seaweed glue in it, it can stay workable to be applied very thinly over the brown coat. Something I haven't mentioned yet, but you might have noticed, is that the Japanese have this funny appreciation for textures. Like the mizugone and noritsuchi, of course the colors are nice, but it's the texture. And they say there's 3 things that are important with a plaster. It's color, it's texture, and if it's a polished finish, it's shine. So those are the 3 qualities that are important with the plaster. And you probably also noticed that in the Japanese finishes, they're almost uniform in color and texture. That's the ideal, which is quite different from the Italian finishes. So that was a Hikizuri finish, using that same type of trowel with an earth plaster with glue. Japan also has an earthen floor tradition that we call tataki. And the Japanese word tataki consists of 3 Chinese characters, 3, harmony, earth. And that's reflective of the ingredients. There's 3 ingredients in tataki. Earth, mountain soil, lime, and brine, I think. It's a byproduct of salt production. And those 3 ingredients are mixed to create earthen floors. The word tataki sounds like the Japanese verb for to pound, tataku, and that's expressive of how the floors are made. They're pounded floors, which if you know about like the earthen floors in Africa or a lot of other traditional places in the world, many of the earthen floors are pounded in different parts of the world, and that's also the case in Japan. They're pounded with these special tools, wooden rammers like you might use in rammed earth, or we even have special trowels that we use to pound with. Also mention that the tataki is generally 2 or 3 courses, and between the courses, in this case, we're using like a plant fiber, these long plant fibers, to create a net between the courses to prevent any kind of cracking, vertical cracking between the courses. Next, I'll talk a little bit about the trowels. Japanese trowels, it's probably said there are a greater variety of Japanese trowels than any other country in the world. Different types of metals in different shapes. And in Japan, metalworking in Japan, I think, also developed to a very high level. During the Edo period in Japan, it was a period of isolation where Japan didn't have a lot of contact with the West. Metalworking developed to a very high level because of sword making. Sword makers were creating swords at that time, combining steel and iron, the steel for the cutting edge and the iron for flexibility. And then as Japan opened up to the West in the Meiji period, there was a law passed that you couldn't make swords anymore. So you had all of these very good craftsmen without work. And then these craftsmen started making carpentry tools and started making plastering tools. And that's part of the reason why carpentry tools and plastering tools developed to such a high level in Japan. And we use different types of steels and irons in our trowels in Japan. Jigane is an iron. And hanyaki is a relatively unfired steel. It's a soft steel. Abureyaki is a steel that's fired. And then after firing, steel is tempered. It's reheated again to make it softer and flexible again. And abureyaki is tempered quite a bit to make it more flexible. And then honyaki is fired and it's not tempered that much. And that's reflected in the word. Honyaki means fully fired. Hanyaki means half fired. And each of these different steels have different purposes. You know that using a wooden float tends to push and pull material, right? Tends to even material. That's the same process that's going on with jigane. Jigane is an iron trowel that's being used to push and pull material to even the plaster. And honyaki, very hard steel used for the finish. Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about the process of making a trowel, and then maybe you'll have a greater appreciation for the trowels and understand why they cost so much. So first thing you have is you've got a piece of steel, right? You cut the rough outline of the steel, then you forge the steel, which means like repeatedly pounding it, and that changes the structure of the steel, makes it denser, and through the firing process, then that's normalized. But after that, then it's cut and sanded, and then fired. And after firing, depending on what trowel it is and what its purpose is, then it's reheated. It's tempered to make it softer again. Then the neck is put in the trowel. It's covered with the lacquer to prevent it from rusting. When in storage, put the handle on, and then you have the finished trowel. And we're going to take a look at just a few of those steps. That's a video, I think, on the left. That's Sugita-san. He's the only nationally recognized artisan trowel maker in Japan. He's in the Fujiwara lineage of metal workers, which is a very famous lineage. And that's the forging process where the trowel is repeatedly pounded. And we have one of his trowels over there and two over there. There's nothing special when you look at it, but it's the quality in the trowel. Next one. And then after it's forged, then it's shaped. You cut it and grind it, polish it down to its shape. And this is Yamanishi-san. Most of the trowels that we provide, probably more than 90% of the trowels are Yamanishi-san's trowels. And he's a certified traditional artisan by Kagawa Prefecture. That's the oven that it's fired in.
What kind of temperature would you say fired?
1,200 degrees Celsius. And depending on the trowel, the temperature which is fired at is different too. Like a polishing trowel would be fired at a higher temperature. And then this is kind of shows you the tempering process. As you temper the steel, the color of it changes. And that's how the craftsman knows, how far to temper it or when it's ready to go. Traditionally, they would temper it over fire. Now they temper it in a saltwater bath. They heat salt water up. And if you look on the left, the yellow, that's the hardest steel. As you move towards the right, as it becomes more like blue, dark blue, purple, then it becomes softer and softer. And as it moves down, becomes softer and softer, that's better for application because a softer steel is going to move the material better than a hard steel will. A hard steel will just slide over it. That's a video on the right. So we already have the hole for the neck pounded, and then the neck is put in. And it's not welded. It's swaged, I guess is the English word. So that neck goes into the plate, and then it's pounded, which expands the neck, because the neck is iron, it's not fired, and that freezes it into the plate. And the size of the neck and the shape of the hole depends on the type of trowel. An application trowel will, of course, be more durable than other types of trowels. The next step is to put the handle on. And then you have the finished trowels. And there's two different types of trowels generally in Japan. We talk about nakakubi, where the neck of the trowel is put between your fingers, and motokubi, which is kind of like the European trowel, which comes out. And if you've worked with the Japanese trowels, you know that there's a real advantage to the nakakubi in terms of control of the plaster, or in control of the trowel.
Question.
Yeah.
After all that incredible artisan, I noticed that the wood is so very plain. It's just a dowel, so to speak. Why is that?
Most of the craftsmen in Japan the artisan craftsmen in Japan will treat their handles after they get it. So you'll get your trowel, you'll purchase a trowel, and the first thing you do is you'll brand it. You'll put your mark on it. So when you take it to a work site, it doesn't walk off. You put your brand on it, and then once you have your brand on it, you oil the handle, and that will improve the longevity and the appearance of the handle. Okay, so that was the traditional portion of the talk, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about contemporary natural building in Japan. We'll take a look at straw bale, light straw clay, and tatami insulation. These are all projects that I've worked on. And the first thing we'll look at is straw bale in Japan. I think Japan is probably at least 10 years, more than 10 years behind Europe and North America in terms of natural building, maybe 20 years. In fact, in 2020, the first energy requirements for buildings go into effect in Japan. Up until this point, there's no requirement for insulation in a building in Japan.
And today, like not
in 2020, the first energy standards go into effect, and I'm hoping that will be good for my work. Yeah. Okay. So next slide. So we all know that straw bale building began in Nebraska, and I think if you press the down arrow, we get an arrow for it. Yep. There's Nebraska, right? And this is the landscape, right? no trees, Great Plains, relatively dry. I think they have 20 inches of rain annually on average. And so I'm often asked, if you go to the next slide, I'm often asked if straw bale building can be applied to Japan. And I think there's a very interesting historical example from Alabama. You probably are familiar with this mansion, right? And if you take a look at the climate in Alabama, it's almost identical to Tokyo in terms of annual temperature, precipitation, and relative humidity. So I think there is a precedent for straw bale in this type of climate. The first straw bale building was finished in 2001 in Japan. It's now folded, no longer existing, but there was a Japan Straw Bale House Association, and they built the first straw bale home. And next, I'm just going to take a look at a couple of straw bale buildings that I've worked on. The first is a Buddhist temple in Yokohama. It's a timber frame, and the bales are stacked on the exterior of a timber frame. And then on the interior of the timber frame, we built like a bamboo lattice, kind of similar to what we would do in an exposed timber, but we did a concealed timber with a bamboo lattice. And then there's a gap. Like one of the difficulties with straw bale in Japan, and it would be great if you could help me with this, is incorporating straw bale and timber frame in Japan. And one of the problems with conventional timber framing in Japan is there's requirements for diagonal bracing, very big diagonal bracing, which inhibits the bales from being placed between the posts, or even trimming the bales to fit between the posts. So I'm looking at ways to work with conventional timber framing, because that's what carpenters are most familiar with. That's what building officials are most familiar with in straw bale.
So the conventional Japanese timber frame now incorporates?
Incorporates diagonal bracing. Okay. Yeah, the traditional Japanese timber framing was flexible, and now conventional Japanese timber framing is hard. Yeah, we do, and you'll see a photo of that later. Yeah, but you know, if the depth of the post, if the depth of the diagonals on the post is 120 millimeters, that's a really, aesthetically, that's a very big gap, or a very big exposure. You know, you'd like something a little closer to the surface for an exposed timber frame. So we built a bamboo lattice, and then between the bales and the bamboo lattice, we made very tight, small straw bundles and stuffed those in. And then we went over the bamboo lattice. And you'll notice that this was all done in a workshop-type format. The stacking of the bales and the base coat of plaster was all done in workshop-type format. And, we were lucky enough to have earth. We actually ordered the earth from Western Japan because the community, the temple community, was very concerned about radiation. And Yokohama is, you know, kind of within, like, where there's still, you know, traces of radiation. Yeah, the bale sizes, I think the square bales are a little bit smaller than North America. Like the height is about 32 centimeters, depth 42 centimeters, and width or length, well, you know, that's adjustable. 80 centimeters to a meter is common.
Inches and feet?
So 14 by 16 by 3 feet.
Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay, comparable? Okay.
It's a little small.
Yeah, a little smaller, because I know in Hokkaido, when I work in Hokkaido, the bales are a little bit bigger. And I think those are probably the same size that are used in North America. And then we've never developed the technology of spraying earth, you know? Because if you imagine the traditional Japanese timber frame with a bamboo lattice, if you sprayed earth on that, it would be spraying mud, you know, into your house and all over the place. So, you know, we still apply mud by hand, which is great for a workshop too. And with a temple community, there's lots of helping hands. Yeah.
Just thought this, I was going to comment earlier, but this might be a good spot to do that.
around here, we go to a large effort and expense and waste in the end of masking all the timbers.
Yeah.
For spraying plaster or whatnot. Even if you're not, I don't see any of that going on there. I see some cardboard going on, certainly in the traditional stuff, but here there's not. Well, maybe they are wrapped in plastic.
The finished timbers are masked.
And
Yeah.
masking edges and stuff. When you do
Yep.
that sort of thing?
Yep. Masking edges. And then generally how I do it, and this is kind of how I was raised. The first straw builder I worked with was in Pennsylvania, Gene Leone, and this is how he did it. So like a clay slip on the bale, and then a really fibrous mix over that, immediately over that. So it's still wet, so that it becomes like one. And so this is great. You know, we've got kids from the preschool mixing their earth and straw fibers for us. Really fibrous mix. And again, that's applied by hand, and we'll use like a long stick, you know, to make sure the walls are plumb. And then something that you probably haven't seen before is what we call in Japan barrel wrapping. And this is an influence from traditional Japanese plastering. And it involves wrapping the whole building with rope, both horizontally and vertically. And you can imagine that during an earthquake, having this mesh of rope in the wall really improves the stability of the wall and the strength. So that's the same effect we were going for.
Is it stitched through?
It's not stitched through. In some cases, what we did was we pounded it in with little bamboo stakes, and in this case, it's just embedded. First, you do vertical, embed it in, then horizontal, embed it in, vertical again, horizontal, and you repeat the process a couple of times. And then after the barrel wrapping, then you go over the whole thing with your last pass of the base coat. So our last base coat pass. And in order to improve adhesion with the middle coat, we put in some scratch marks. And I'm sure this is the same thing you do in North America, or you probably are much faster than we are. If you look at a lot of the unfinished earthen storehouses in the countryside of Japan that haven't been finished, they just have the base coat on, you'll see these markings. And every craftsman does the markings differently. And kind of every step during the building process, or this is what I've been taught, every step during the building process should be beautiful. So it could be stopped at that point, and that would be okay. So that was the aesthetic with putting in the lines in the wall as well. No problem. What was that?
The rope they use, what kind of fiber?
Straw rope or a palm rope. Yeah. Oh, okay, and then this is the interior. It's the same process. Earth plaster on bamboo. In this case, we were working, on scaffolding, so only craftsmen would work up high. Real quick review. So like kind of a slip coat, then this really fibrous mix to make the wall flat, but it's only done in like the depression, the areas where it's depressed. Then a base coat over that. That's completely dried, and then Chirimawari around all the openings, around all the woodwork, doors, and then the brown coat. And this was a brown coat finish coat. Yeah, this is the interior finish. And then this is the brown coat when it's still wet. There's still moisture in the plaster of the brown coat. And in the brown coat, we generally, on a straw bale building, we'll use, well, I don't know if I would say generally, but I like to, if possible, use fiberglass mesh and embed that into the brown coat, because it really eliminates any cracking and strengthens the wall.
Wait, what? Looking at that picture, you're saying that you mask the timbers and such.
Right.
That's a finished brown coat, so you're done?
We're done.
Okay.
Yep.
I was wondering if you redo the masking in between, or you just
Redo the masking.
You do peel
Yeah.
it each time?
Well, it depends on the money, the budget. If you know, so a customer with a larger budget, yeah, you go to every extent.
You get clean line.
Yeah. This is just some more of the interior. On the left is like a straw relief, where the temple, right next door to the temple, they have a daycare service for the elderly, and this was straw that the elderly grew in pots. So that was what we used. Some of it is what we put in the plaster and what we used for the relief. And this is just more of the interior. You know, when these stones fall out, a little like wood glue, you know, or caulking can really hold them in well. Yeah. So that was completed in April of 2012. And yeah, it was really the members and the people who participated in the workshop made this happen, because you know there's so much labor involved in that. So it's really thanks to them we could do this. And then the brown coat was just done by a small team of craftsmen, myself and a few other people.
How long did it take?
We started raising the bales started in October of 2011, and the plaster was done in March of 2012. And yeah, we had to really force it because the plaster doesn't want to dry in winter. And there was a tea room that you didn't see much of, but the tea room, because of the architect's drawings, it required a lot of plaster. Another building I just finished last year in Hokkaido, and Hokkaido has a climate very similar to Canada in many ways, cold climate. This is also timber frame, conventional timber frame with straw bales stacked on the outside of the timber frame, and in this case, like you can see here, the diagonals are exposed. And for myself, this is probably the most efficient project I've been involved in. Bales stacked in 4 days, plaster, base coat, external interior up in 4 days, and then the finished plaster in 2 days. We had about 10 to 15 volunteers every day. The exterior finish is a tosa shikkui, and that's the straw and lime plaster. And in this case, we did a texture finish. We added some aggregate to it, and then little handheld pieces of styrofoam. Use those to put a texture in the finish. No, we bought this from Kochi Prefecture. Yeah. And then this is the interior finish. It's an earthen floor in the entranceway, and then that's a polished tosa shikkui that I did around the sink. Okay, this next example, I think this is the last straw bale example. This is a building I worked on, and I think it was 2010 in Fukushima. And this was before the nuclear accident. This building, I think, is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, the earth that we used was recycled from a 150-year-old farmhouse. When they were taking down the walls, they saved the earth. We just remixed it. It was like a perfect blend of clay and aggregate, and we just added more straw fiber and used that for the earth. And I think the other reason why this is a special, it was intended to be finished, but the following year they had the nuclear incident, and this is in a no entry, an evacuation zone in Itatemura. I've gone back a number of times in there to collect data, but it's never been finished. So you see on the left the levels of intensity of the earthquake, and Japan measures earthquake intensity on a special scale. They call it the Shindo scale. It's a 7-point scale, and Itatemura was a 6 on that scale. So it was a very, very strong earthquake, and there was no cracking in the plaster. And I think it's not because the plaster was, I mean, of course it was strong in its own way, but I think that's because it's a very stiff timber frame that absorbed a lot of energy, And the bale walls and the earth and plaster were flexible enough to be able to deal with that. Yeah. Oh, well, it was completely dry. Yeah, yeah, maybe it was 2009. It was completely dry when it happened. Yeah. And you kind of see outside the building the pavement was cracked around the building, but no cracking in the wall. What's that?
Well, just the different expansion and contraction rates, say a plaster versus timber frame. How could it not give somewhere?
It was built completely. It was built on the interior of the timber frame, and in this case, we used a cellulose insulation between the posts, and it has a rain screen exterior, and built on the interior of the timber frame, and it's tied to the timber frame.
And I'm still struggling with the way you, even with the chinking that you the mesh that you put in, that
Right.
binds the plaster to the posts and stuff.
There's none of that in this wall.
Would be different between the wood and the plaster.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So something has to give in my
Yep.
woodworking
Yeah.
mind frame.
Yep. Yeah, you're right.
So I find it fascinating that you're not dealing with cracks somewhere. You don't have to put a V-joint in.
If well, it has a lot of fiber in it, so it's very strong. I mean, it's more strong than a sand earth mix would be in terms of tensile strength and bending strength. You do see some cracking around the north end, but not in all buildings. Sometimes. And also, what's very important too is traditionally, before they do the finish or the Chirimawari, they let it dry for like a year. So the building goes up, you put on the bamboo lattice, you put on the base coat of plaster, the big fix around it, you have a relatively flat plane, and then it sits like that for a year.
So it's allowed to shrink away.
Right, so the wood moves and the earth moves, yeah. But now it's like, we don't have time to wait that long. A trick that some people have been doing now around the Chirimawari, around the woodwork, is doing a gypsum. A gypsum, because gypsum doesn't shrink. Going around the woodwork with like a gypsum Chirimawari, and then going over that with earth. Okay. And then this next example is a light straw clay building. And you probably know that light straw clay has its origins in Central Europe, Germany, and Canada is probably like years and years ahead of us in terms of light straw clay. My research studio, we've been doing some testing with light straw clay, making different samples with different types of aggregates, different densities, and testing the thermal conductivity, looking at the insulation of it. And the first light straw clay home in Japan was completed in 2013 in Nagano Prefecture. The process we used for building, it's also a conventional timber frame with a lot of joinery in it, because the carpenter is an older carpenter who can still do a lot of the hand joinery. Yeah, this is something else I should mention. So in the Japanese timber frames today, probably 90% of them, or I mean the majority of them, are machine cut, computer cut. Is it the same in Canada?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. That's probably not new information for you then. But yeah, the majority of them, you put the plans into a computer, and the computer cuts the joints for you. But this is a hand cut structure.
Yeah, there's still hand cut. Those guys are out. Don't worry.
Okay.
But yeah, if you go to a big shop, it's all good.
Yeah. Okay. And then on the interior and exterior, we just used Nojita. This is probably Japanese cedar boards as formwork. And put the mix in there next. And then we also have toenailed in wood inside the wall every 60 centimeters to 2 feet to stop any kind of settling of the wall. And then to improve the seismic resistance, we have lath on both sides of the wall. because buildings are going to move in Japan, and you don't want that light straw clay wall falling out. Yeah. And what we found was that it was just too much work putting up the shuttering, taking it off, putting on the lat. So we just put the lat up and used that as shuttering. And the advantages was a time saver. The disadvantages is that the lat we were using was too thin, and it would bend slightly. It was slightly blow. So we need to pack a little lighter or use thicker lat. Okay, next. What's that? Oh, we just used one thickness, and I can't recall exactly how thick it was. Sorry. Yep. And then on the exterior, we used a wood siding on the first floor of the exterior to protect from rain, and wood siding on the exterior to protect from rain, and the vertical. In Japan we call them dobuchi. I'm not sure what they're called in strapping, in furring, yeah. That goes over the posts on the exterior, and then we plaster between those, and then wood siding over that. And on the second floor, on the exterior, a lime plaster. Go ahead.
Around the posts, would you use a certain technique to seal them?
We didn't.
No.
We did, but we did it multiple times. With an increasing sand content, so it would have less shrinkage. Yeah. Okay, and then this last example, or this last method, is tatami insulation. Have you ever heard of tatami before? It's a traditional Japanese flooring material that's used. Consists of traditionally entirely straw with igusa is the name of the plant. I'm not sure what its common name is or what its scientific name is, but it has a thin igusa cover over the top. And traditionally, yeah, go ahead, next slide. Traditionally, tatami, they would maybe last about 20 years or so, and then the tatami kind of get old, so they would be recycled. And the way in which they're recycled is they're usually chopped up and used as straw fiber and earthen plasters. But in recent years, the use of earthen fibers or the use of earthen plasters has decreased, so there's a problem with disposal of tatami. And there's especially a disposal problem with tatami, with the modern tatami, because the modern tatami will sometimes have a styrofoam core in the tatami. The straw tatami are oftentimes left in gardens or around fruit trees and used as mulch. And I'm not sure who thought of the idea first. I know of some recent examples in Japan. And in recent years, I've been working to reuse tatami as insulation in walls. And this is, we know that your traditional Japanese timber frame is post and beam with no diagonal bracing. So you have a perfect square place to put tatami into. And we use split bamboo. Go ahead. To hold the tatami in place. There's a small 2x6 or 2x4 in there, sized mill to fit the tatami. And then you can go over that with an earthen plaster. Yeah, depending on the thickness of the post, or if you want an exposed timber or a concealed timber, it depends on how many tatami mats you want to put in, what aesthetic, what look you want. And I worked on one project actually where we used the tatami in place of drywall. So we used the tatami as a large board, and just like you would with drywall, first we did the joints with lime and jute, it's a jute hemp mesh, like burlap. It's like burlap, but it's in strips. I think in Japan it's commonly used to protect tree trunks. We use that over the joints and yeah, okay. And then we went over that with just a lime plaster. With the Shikkui plaster, it's probably just a couple of millimeters thick. And the reason why we chose Shikkui plaster in this example is because it can be done very, very thin over the tatami. It adheres very well because of the seaweed glue in it. It has very good adhesion, and it looked very good. Yeah, this is some of the niches that you might see in a straw bale, what we did with the tatami. If you'd like any more information, you can take a look at the blog that I use to show, to share my own work. It's called Hyakusho, which means peasant, farmer in English. Or you can take a look at the small company that sells Japanese tools, Kiwado or Japanese Plastering. Okay. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you.